Well, ciao Luisa.
Ciao.
Well, this is almost a known official event of the research network in social movements with whom I share social movements of the Council of European Studies with, and Luisa and I both share, and we had shared it previously and is still part of the board. So it's good to see everyone together. It's really good to introduce Luisa today. She is a researcher here in our neighbors, the Institute of Social Science from the University of Lisbon. She did her PhD in urban and regional planning, both Palermo and Berlin, right? And I think part of the work you will present today is from your PhD dissertation. So I won't say much about that, but as she tells us here, her research focuses on the attempt to define if and when these practices of occupation and grasp and reappropriation of practices of the space achieve to have an impact upon contemporary policy making and urban agenda. And so in order to define that, she traces the analysis of how and under which conditions these practices pioneering new ideas have been facilitated, hampered, or co-opted, especially in different European cities. And also in the last few years, she's also working on the housing struggle in Barcelona in order to describe the differences, interactions between these different groups in the housing struggle, I believe, right? And with the ultimate intention of defining their institutional impacts. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
30 to 40 minutes, as I told you previously. Thank you.
Okay, so
maybe share.
I will give you this.
Okay. We can see Luisa, I'll say.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming today. Today I'm presenting this paper I've been writing for the journal Urban Planning that was actually recently rejected because of I should rework on conclusions, but it was a different way to analyze what I had already researched for my PhD dissertation, as Tiago introduced. So basically for my PhD dissertation, I did analyze two cities, Berlin and Rome, that were characterized by a long and steady period of radical practices of appropriation of space. And in particular, I wanted to focus on public spaces since this produced a higher level of negotiation with institutions. And since I am an urban planner, I was trying to understand at which point there was the opportunity from the planner point of view to include, negotiate with these bottom-up, often radical proposals. So in this case, during my research, what I came through was that these practices eventually could become an alternative from the increasing reduction of public spaces. And so in this presentation, I will decline this, I will analyze this aspect under the understanding of what is right-sizing policies and how these radical alternatives can be actually an alternative to these policies. So in particular, I focused today on Berlin, but first of all, I will introduce a little bit the idea of right-sizing policies and how it is related to shrinkage. So shrinkage, generally, it's related to population losses, and it's a phenomenon that always happened, but more recently it became a research field in its own respects. And so it's related to planning for a reduced population size. The point here is to connect this to a perspective that sees right-sizing policies as embedded into a wider context of neoliberal urbanization, and also in relation to a demand for more attention on site-specific solutions and pathways in urban development. So the controversial interpretation of these right-sizing policies is that provides new spatial fix for investments, but also can be defined as an exclusionary project. In terms of new spatial fix for investments, for example, we can see public stock that is left for a long time under disinvestment and abandonment, and then offered to investors as opportunity to make more money into current or future, for example, gentrifying areas. And the exclusionary project, it's instead, for example, when these programs of alienation focus on low-income or ethnic minority neighborhoods, like the case I will present today. And within these strategies, what happens is the renovation, reduction or privatization of public and social services in the areas in which these are located, producing ultimately an increase in social polarization. And this makes this the limits of these right-sizing policies when they are identified as a form of smart shrinkage. So deciding where to shrinkage in order to, at the end, facilitate capital accumulation and ultimately produce an exclusionary project. So the dominant discourse behind this reproduction of these right-sizing policies that became pretty common in the last years, it's obviously the decreasing population, the inefficiency or redundancy of public spaces or services, the fact that cities demonstrate to be in a constant state of fluctuating economy, and so related austerity policies, the implementation of the need for implementation of quick solutions. So, for example, competing for business or middle-class residents, and the idea of the higher efficiency in conversion of public services to private sector. But what there is actually behind, it's basically paradigms of dominant growth, the growing pressure of financial markets and interurban competition, and also the phenomenon of accumulation by dispossession. That is a concept developed by Harvey, taking the idea of primitive accumulation by Marx, in which he explains how in the later capitalism, a new form of capital accumulation is based on the conversion of common, collective, and state forms of property rights into exclusive private property rights. So this involves, for my understanding, also public spaces and services. All this, I argue, often triggers forms of resistance exactly against these forms of repossession and privatization of public assets, because this threatens the possibility for collective initiatives. So due to that, I've been observing that in the last decades, there has been a rekindled interest in forms of direct social action, like, for example, these practices of reclaiming public spaces. That can go from a more radical form of squatting or illegal occupation to forms of more institutionally driven solution of negotiation with the local institutions. In particular, these forms of reclaiming spaces are developed in resistance, exactly, I argue, to these smart shrinking strategies of gentrification that intensify ultimately social inequality, the top-down right-sizing impairing social justice, and the fact that the state institutions shows to be incapable to provide alternatives to this increasing social polarization. And so they kind of developed through these practices, and we will see also in this case study that I've been analyzing, a form of counter-discourse from the dominant discourse that allow the application of these forms of policies to this counter-discourse that starts talking about co-state management and subsidiarity with the state when it comes to public properties or services, radical participation, rhetoric more connected to social sustainability and urban justice, and the idea of the possibility to implement bottom-up strategies that can perform degrowth as alternative to forms of urban development and planning. So here another element enters the discourse is if this movement can be described as forms of degrowth urban social movement. If we define degrowth, as Latouche say, as something that concern is easily linked to support of autonomy and relocalization, and mostly against the exacerbation of dependency. So we're talking about dependency to private sector, evidently. In degrowth, what they propose is, first of all, they say that economic growth is not the only acceptable rationale in urban planning, and that local solution, and they're also criticizing the fact that the local solution often remain non-communicative with concerns about social, economic, or ecological limits that our cities actually facing. So basically, these strategies of co-self-management of public spaces, I argue, are showing the capacity of informal actors to propose alternatives that are feasible and are alternatives to actually shrinking public spaces. Because they don't rely on the economic growth development solutions, but on community and collective management, eventually putting power relations into question. So this case, I took this paradigmatic case to analyze, in which there is resistance against privatization with the creation of a radical alternative social project that we will see now. So this case I've been analyzing, it's a building that is called Bethanien, that is located quite in the center of Berlin now, in the east side of Kreuzberg. And it has been concerned by two main strategy of resistance involving occupation along the decades, because evidently community has some strong attachment to this place. So first of all, this is a map of Berlin. I'm showing where Bethanien is located. It's on the right side, and you can see a white arrow from Yorkstrasse. You'll see after white, but just to understand a little bit what's the position of this place. So the interesting part of this conflict is that this specific building or complex has been involved twice in an idea of right-sizing policies. First time during the 70s due to the construction of the wall, since this building was a hospital and it was located, once the wall was built very near to the wall, it lost a big chunk of the people and patients and nurses that were that were working in the hospital, and so justified by population loss and out-migration, the first resistance performed was against the destruction of this hospital. And the second phase was instead connected to policies designed to manage decline into context of neoliberal urban development, and it's in the early 2000s. The interesting part is that in these two different situations, the apparent redundancy of the same public infrastructure, it was managed in two radically different ways. So in the 70s, there was a big flow of public funding directed to the city that was obviously intended to preserve the population, the decreasing population of the city due to the construction of the wall. Here I mentioned some of the public funding involved, and this specific situation created a special Kreuzberg mix that has been during the decades also developing a very resistant population, we can say so. And then during 2000s, instead, the strategy was based on public disinvestment and progressive privatization of public assets and tasks, and the intent to attract private capital flows. So this is the cover of a journal from then, 1975, describing the first struggle for Bethanien, campaign in which the building was, so as I resume here, in the 68th, the administration planned the closure of this and large demolition of this building for the to host big public housing stocks. 769, the campaign against this destruction started, and eventually in 1970, the building became a city property. And then in 1970, the management of the main building was assigned to a few local-based non-profit organizations that are involved in cultural and artist activities. 71, well, I will show this in the map. So you can see the wall on the other side, East Berlin. So you can see how this area was touching the wall, and that made the area particularly peripheral in that specific era of the city. And how, so this building, the yellow part is the one where the cultural activities were located, always non-profit organization. The purple one is the one that was spotted in 1971 by a group of students, and within 1 year was legalized into a youth hostel, and it still existing today as a house project. And then the orange part is the part that is interested by my analysis, that were in 1974 the place where a big job center, a German, Turkish library, a nursery, etc., several public services were located. And then the second campaign called Bedanian for All, that has been mostly the focus of my analysis. So until 2002, basically the situation remained the same until the borough of Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg planned to sell this Bedanian complex. So they started moving all the public services out of this complex in order to make space for this international cultural incubator they wanted to create. In 2005, moreover, in 2005, the Senator of Finance of State of Berlin introduced this calculatorische Kosten, and we'll see why they are relevant, that basically made public property too expensive for local administration, pushing ultimately for privatization. So basically, the neighbors in this moment are faced with rightsizing policies that are derived from multi-scale level of governance and are deprived of many of these public spaces. And besides that, they are prevented from proposing any alternatives to privatization or use the space, or even from accessing the vacated structures. On the top of everything, but at the same time, a new legislation regarding the possibility to implement local referendum was introduced in 2004. So it's also important to stress that this area, although the forecast for the development of the area was very much looking forward for a new middle creative class to come and live around this area. That's why this cultural center they wanted to create. We should see that Mariannenplatz area, it's included in this quartiers management project that is basically analyzing 38 areas of Berlin that are highly affected by social degradation and high rates of social disadvantage, areas with special development needs. And we can see that all this red area is basically surrounding the field of the, so I mean, it wasn't actually matching the perspective of the local administration with the actual reality of the neighborhood in that moment. And so also the relocation of all these social services had an important impact on the population who was actually really using this space with this reason. So basically this generated the conflict that was both based on the mobilization of the citizen against the privatization of the Bedanian complex, that, by the way, was a kind of symbolic space for the neighborhood, and also very much against the reduction and displacement of assets and the gentrification derived from that. But at the same time, a second phenomenon happened, that was the eviction of a historical house project in Yorkstrasse in Berlin. So basically in 2005, there are two parallel situations undergoing. That is, on one side, the creation of this initiative for future Bedanian, this group of local community that started organizing for collecting signs for a referendum, and at the same time the squatting of this vacated south wing building of Betanian complex. So basically the squatters, they weren't squatters, actually they were renting, but the inhabitants of this house project is, I don't know if you know this word, but basically are forms of collective living. At the beginning, there used to be squats. After, they were basically just low rent, cheap rent spaces where there is collective forms of living. This place was vacated because of, again, gentrification processes. And so all these people, in order to protest and find another place, basically squatted this south wing building. So the two, eventually what happened is that these two groups merged and they started working together, and they successfully collected 14,000 signatures for the petition of a local referendum called Bürgerbegehren. But this referendum never happened, because at this point, what happened is that the local administration offered a roundtable to discuss and negotiate a solution with these groups. So this is a photo after the squatting. What is written behind is Betanian squatted, besetzt. These are the squatters, and these two people in front, it's this from the Green Party that was leading Kreuzberg borough at the time, and this was a press conference organized by the squatters. So I here mentioned briefly an interview to one of the squatters that was a previous tenant of York Strasse house project, in which he basically said that, well, they invented the campaign. So basically she said that before there was just few people trying to do something, but once they squatted this place and they merged their forces, and also this action of squatting successfully attracted the public opinion over this issue. And so it's where she said the real protest mobilization started. So we can see how this mix of radical practices like actual occupation with various state-driven mechanisms like demonstrations, referendum, local petitions, and roundtable had a major impact. So the movement plus squat plus referendum obtained to be heard by institution, get to access a roundtable for negotiation, and the creation of the document, a new concept for Betanian and alternative management proposal. So this is the document they've been producing during 3 years negotiation and roundtables with the local administration. That is called New Concept for Betanian. In this book, they basically individuated alternatives to privatization through the creation of a self-managed and non-commercial cultural, artistic, political, and social center for all. That's the exact translation I did from the book. In order to do that, they did an analysis of the costs of the management. That was the main issue for the administration. That, in fact, this group of inhabitants was there was also some economists in the middle, so they were really capable to tackle and analyze the problem in deep. And in fact, after 3 years of negotiation, an agreement was reached. I will just stop a little bit more on this economic issue they've been analyzing. So basically, they realized that the main problem was the excessive cost of management of this building. And this was due to these imputed costs, or kalkulatorische Kosten, that is this law introduced in 2005 I was mentioning before. So the problem is that the Berlin Senate imposed on the public property management of the district this way to calculate management costs that was increasing very much the price confronted to the real management costs. And this ended up producing the controversial effect that renting private land was cheaper than used public-owned building for public purpose. And the result is a solid and engineered forced privatization of public estate. That was they found out, basically. So this is the analysis they did, and we can see on the left the actual cost of management per year, that is around 500,000 euro. Then in the middle, we have how much it would be the management with these imputed costs. If it's a private sector managing the building, it goes less than 600,000 euros. But when it comes to the public administration, it grows to almost 1,400,000 euros. So it's 3 times the actual cost of management. And it's actually costs that do not exist. It's just a matter of a calculation. Also, it's interesting that this information was created by the local administration, as you can see under there, because of citizens' request in 2005. So citizens asked to the Board of Administration to create this information for their debate, and that's the result you are observing. So basically, in this chapter 4.3 of this book, that is based on ownership model, they found the solution, and the solution was to individuate a third body that it's in order to avoid these entire indirect costs. So the problem was, if it's the public administration managing it, it costs a lot. But if it's a third body that doesn't have to be a private investor, then these imputed costs are not existing anymore. And so they break down the main reason behind the privatization, basically. So the administration of Betanian is outlined presenting models of self-government, residence forum, and sponsorship, so that the organization of a self-finance project for the self-management of Betanian would have been feasible. And so basically what they did was to address a non-profit agency, the GSES, that is the Society for Urban Development of Berlin, basically. And they translated the property to this society, and then the society made a lease contract to a constituted non-profit company that was that were the groups inside the south wing building of Betanian. I don't know if you're following me. So basically, the groups that squatted or reclaimed this building that was vacated after a long process of negotiation constituted themselves into a non-profit company and rented the building for a very cheap price to this still kind of semi-public agency or non-profit company that is this Society for Urban Development. It's a society that is basically taking it's managing properties, public properties for their often for their privatization or for their management. But in this case, they were just the society that could make a list for this group. So basically, the result was that this collective self-management was regularized, and they avoided basically the privatization of this public property. As I say here, it's in 2009, they signed this 15 years renewable lease contract that is still on, and they are very, they're pretty sure that it's going to be renovated soon. So in this contract, basically, it's indicated the responsibility in the management and the maintenance of the Betanian South Wing. So for example, right now there is a part where there is people living, it's about 30 tenants, and they are paying a rent of 250 euros per month, while when the average rent now in the same area, it's around 600 euros per month. And so they found a way to, because this house project also, their idea is to kind of take out of the capital, how do you say, sorry? Yeah, they want to take out of the market these properties in order to have a more rentable housing solution. But also they achieved to save all the other groups that were actually working in this area, so the kindergarten and the Healer Alternative Medicine School. So there are, as I show in the bottom of this slide, there are several groups that are actually working actively in this South Pool. So at the end of this story, I would analyze some pitfalls and some conclusions. So a pitfall that I can see from this kind of story, let's see, is the pitfall of the rhetoric of big society. That is when like voluntary non-profit business actors are hijacked within a context of state withdrawal as potential alternatives for local administration to provide local services. So at the end, these people is basically voluntarily offering a set of public services and they're not paid for that. So the only thing they get back is to pay a cheaper rent, and they actually have to take care of all the costs of maintenance of a very big and old building. Although, I mean, the structural issue would be paid by the public administration. So it's if you put this into context of the current austerity moment and shrinking economic resources, we don't really know if this is aligned to this process or it's actually contrasting this process in a way. So as I say here, it would this big society pitfall end up weakening the role of the public institutions in providing state help and fostering the cooptation of self-help policies for the poor and for the management of non-utilitarian public spaces. That's a question I have. And the other pitfall is this the fact that these new short-term citizen-led interventions, as Colomb already argued in 2012, end up often being used as gap fillers while there is a moment of low market interests on an area, and so traditional forms of urban development could not be implemented. So basically, there is no offer, so they just permit these things to happen for a while and then they kick them out, and so also this can produce the effect to increase the land value and then be displaced after demolition or redevelopment of the area. For example, here in Barcelona, in Lisbon, we can observe the Arroz Studios case. It's a kind of similar case, and all in general, the area of Beato, it's called, or this this ex-industrial area where a lot of cultural activities have been allowed for a while, and then once the area increases value and its visibility, they're kicked out, and a more traditional form of urban development is applied on the area. So so the ultimate pitfall, if we are talking about resisting this smart shrinkage, is that in this framework, the smart shrinkage discourse and right-sizing policies can be further justified, because basically we're keeping weakening the role of the state and its capacity to maintain these spaces, and then we can ultimately justify it. The positive outcomes on the other side is that these informal actors, have showed the capacity to propose feasible alternative solutions to the shrinking of the public space. I wanted to focus in particular on the economic analysis to show that it was actually feasible. I mean, they analyzed all the potential economic issue in the management of a very big public property, and they find a solution that it's economically feasible and represent a zero-cost solution for the public administration and a solution for the local community. And the interesting part is that these don't rely on quick economic growth development solutions, as most of the urban development policies do, while it relies on community, local, and collective management. Another positive outcome is showing the capacity of these informal actors, as I was saying before, is to put power relation into question. So it's not anymore a top-down it's not the solution just individuated by a top-down understanding of the problem, but it's at the end it facilitates a bottom-up proposal to stand the chance to eventually change the planning prerogatives and plans. So I would close with, I don't know if I'm okay with yeah. So with some questions, and then if you want also I will dip in a little bit on a specific issue. So the questions that I'm still that I think are crucial at this point is to understand, first of all, if it is possible to scaling up these alternative forms of management, because we see now one case, obviously in a big city. I've been in my PhD thesis analyzing several cases like this, but in terms of numbers, obviously, it doesn't stand a chance to say that it's already proven on a high scale to work. It's always like singular cases that are negotiated. So the first question, obviously, is if we can think about it, the scaling up and in order to understand these alternative forms of management of public assets as actually a way to reverse the trend of public spaces shrinking, in particular in neighborhoods that are affected by strong speculative interests. The second question is it possible to imagine a substitution to quick economic growth development strategies, scaling up community-based solutions and subsidiarity between formal and informal actors, in particularly with proposal based on growth and autonomy and opposing the exacerbation of dependency towards the private sector? That's the second important question. In particular, I mentioned more than once this subsidiarity concept. In Italy, this concept is also part of the constitution, and it's basically discussed that when public institutions are in need of looking for other solutions, they can collaborate with the communities, local communities, in order to find a collective solution. So it means also delegating to them the management, for example, of public spaces and services. And then the third question is allowing residents to get collective control over these spaces, allowed to develop more socially, economically, or environmentally understanding of collective spaces, provision and management, or would overcharge inhabitants of excessive responsibility in the maintenance of public resources and services. That is what I was mentioning with the possible pitfalls. Yeah, I have this problem with slides with a lot of information, sorry. So, yeah, I mean, the conclusions are basically various and have been already mentioned in my presentation. But what we are trying to, okay, I will be reading a little bit so to look at myself, but basically strategies in urban development are the products of complex processes characterized by contingencies, social material interactions, and distributed reflexive, foresightful agency. This case helps constructing opportunity spaces to counteract path dependency, that's important, with a shift towards governance in developing strategy making, harnessing the imagination of social framing and mobilizing distributed agency. So basically, how actually imagine a difference from this path dependency always based on growth and on privatization and as we're seeing smart shrinkage, and instead focus on different alternative forms of governance and on the imagination of the social framing and the possibilities that involves the mobilization of distributed agency, redefining actually power relations. And how in times of crisis, these communities have proven that are capable to step in and to fill the gap in organized responses, often bypassing planning making. Yeah. So the hope basically is this action could slowly become normalized practices and facilitated by formal institutions. But I think, as I said, that in order to achieve that point, we have to first answer those questions that I was proposing before. And if I have a few other minutes, I don't know if you want to know a little bit about the contextual situation. So I was mentioning this at the end just to say that sometimes I bring these cases, and the other very big problem is the translation of a practice from a place to another, because many practices happen in a place for very contextual reasons. Berlin, it's a place, and like this neighborhood, this area, this city, where are places where all this could happen because of also historical development of the city and its community, etc. So I was basically shortly mentioning how Berlin has been characterized by an historical geography of protests that started from the late 60s until now, basically, and has been through cycles of social mobilization that was from the youth protesters to the actual squatter movement. It was mainly during 70s, 80s, and the beginning of the 90s. and then evolved to tenants movements, so more institutionally driven groups during 2000s, the refugee movement, and last but not least, many urban social movements that have been arising lately, opposing mega projects of urban development, the mega spray. So there are like mega development projects for the city that have been opposed. All this has produced cycles of oppression, normalization, regression, and eventually inclusion and cooptation along these decades. And this also tells us something about the fact that this conflict not only arise in that specific area, but then had stand the chance to have a space for negotiation with the authorities. Things that do not happen everywhere, but maybe in a city where this historical confrontation between public administration or institutions and radical movements or urban social movement have paved the way for let's say, the possibility to imagine a space of negotiation. And also I was mentioning a few elements that made the city so much affected by squatting, and also because it's related to a big presence of urban spaces, the extraordinary geography of the West Berlin due to the wall, obviously, that made today's essential area at that time very peripheral, like the one that we have just seen where the case study is located. A very special social fabric that was particularly in Kreuzberg composed by students and a lot of immigrants that were constantly working on the right to difference and to experimenting different and alternative lifestyles. The very specific political geographical situation of this suspended age between the annexation between one side and the other that made the planning strategies very various, and also this kind of perception of absence of urban democracy that produced the opposition of opposed forms of insurgent urbanism. So basically, people felt that all the urban development projects developed during decades were never really negotiated, were never really inclusive of local groups instances. So this created a kind of form of resistance too. This is a map that shows the 650 entities that have been squatting along the time in Berlin. That's been produced by a comrade from this group I was part of, that's called Squatting European Collective. And then here it's just a few images of some of the most recent conflicts that have been arising in the city, just to have an idea that it's a city where the resistance is very alive, and also in particular in the last 2 decades it has been because it has been related to the resistance against strong phenomena of gentrification, displacement, and touristification. And while many of them apply to a very politicized neighborhood like Kreuzberg. So obviously this created a big conflict between politicized groups, anti-capitalist groups, and these very capitalist neoliberal strategies imposed on this specific area. And yeah, with this I would finish, maybe go back to the questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Luisa. You want to keep the questions, or
No.
or should we open?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Or do you want to?
Because I need to leave, because I'm teaching, so I need to leave. I mean, so
you start.
I take the privilege to. So it's not a question, because if not, I don't have time to listen to your answer. So I just wanted to just give some comments. And first of all, I really liked your presentation. And I really, well, I would like to, I think it's a really good material for a book. Maybe already writing the book about your, I think it will be really, because, well, I know your approach is really, I think that you can say even much more things from here.
Yeah.
And of course, with the height of social movement studies, I'm saying this because your conclusions are mostly kind of conclusion very macro, and in terms of policies and governance also. And by the way, I think a good journal to submit this paper is also governance. I think it's very open to this kind of thing. So if you want, but there are, I think, other things that you can explore. Many more about there is this new tendency of looking at social movements as infrastructures. And particularly, we had here a presentation by Harakuki and other Greek colleagues, because these experiences are very common, for instance, in Greece, in Athens, and particularly in the solidarity movement. So movements that are, okay, we already are much further in respect to the view of movements that just protest in the streets. We all know now that they do much more than that. They create things, they experiment, they influence public policies, and this idea of looking at movements as infrastructure, I think is very interesting here. So I think that is a good approach, and also the literature about direct action, prefigurative politics, and all these things. I think it can be used to explore, but your case can also contribute to this literature. So I think that there is that. And on the other side, I think that what you say about these continuous interactions between protests and local government, and the case of planning is also very interesting, and how the political process and the policy processes are co-built. So we usually think about social movements influence as something that happened, and after you have the response of the authorities and like this. And here you rightly show that there are many intermediate phases and bodies. So there is a kind of a really like this concept of players and arenas, because in literature by Giorgio to look at this context as much more plural, to look at this situation as a contentious arena, and where you have many different actors involved. And this is the results is really as you show it very well in this last slide, is the result is continuously under construction. So it's this processual understanding and relational, I really like. So stop here, and I like to thinking about this thing for the next meeting we have.
Should I reply to you before?
Maybe before.
I can say a few things briefly. Well, first of all, the kind of focus I did is because I'm an event planner, so obviously I have a focus that's a bit more. And it was
not perfectly sense.
Yeah.
I just think that you can say also that.
No, sure. No. I just wanted to say and share that when I started my research, it was a bit complicated, because like squatting, like occupying illegally a space, is kind of opposed to planning. So at the beginning, there is very little literature about that. So how urban planning can analyze this kind of phenomena, no? But basically, this is one of the things. For example, if planning, it means policies, and so public policies for housing, for public spaces, for heritage management. How much the local communities enter in this possibility to go management, or in looking for alternatives, or in pushing for radical alternatives, like we've seen in housing shortage along these decades, that often was producing these squatting experiences or radical solutions. So in these terms, I've been trying to focus on policies and really about dominant discourses. So generally, it's like that's the only way we can do, because there is the state of fluctuating economy of the city. There is all this withdrawal of the state, so there is no funds, etc. So the only way it's privatizing, the only way it's introducing like partnership with private actors, but there are other ways that are not given the space often because of the need of quick solutions, etc. But this analysis I wanted to propose was exactly in this direction, like to say, no, there are actually solutions that are also feasible, and they demonstrated to be so. They just need the space for the negotiation, and that means, and my analysis, what I realized, that sometimes it means that there is the absence of tools for creating an actual space for negotiation. there is no laws or like institutional tools for recognizing these practices on a map. Like many urban planners do not know how to recognize the existence of something on a map. That is, everybody knows it's there, but there is no tool to say that that thing is there because it's unrecognizable, let's say, in terms of tools. Also tools to create a space for like local referendums or roundtables or actually a higher level of participation. And then what's the last thing you say? Sorry, I wanted to say something about it.
About this important
yeah.
interaction.
About this, well, basically my first
Which is very connected to this point of negotiation.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my first observation was obviously this fact of here, half of the thing disappeared, but of the fact that one like movement pushing in certain direction produce a reaction that eventually produced the evolution of the first claim in a constant circle, evolutive circle that is, well, very generative of the political in general, I guess. But the interesting part for me, it was more related to how policies constantly try to neutralize. So basically, it's a Gramscian, very old concept, but that applies very well on this case for me, because basically what I constantly observed is that the claims were absorbed in a way that was removing the subversive content of the claim and interjecting this claim into aligned neoliberal solutions or policies.
Yeah.
But yet this permitted to create a brick for the movement to like evolve. And I always say mostly to create barricades, because what I observe is that lately movements can more build barricades than actually pretend to confront really with the institutions or with the power, because of contextual situations that we do know. So these bricks I'm talking about is maybe resulting in a law for yeah, okay. Okay, but
Don't worry.
basically
Okay. Yeah, we continue.
So for example,
Ciao.
in the case of Berlin, there is this very interesting article that has been written by Holm and Kuhn. I'm looking for it just to say what's the title, and find it. And it does talk about the relationship between the squatting movement in Berlin and the strategies of urban renewal, and how much they are related, or how much like a squatting movement had an impact on renewal strategies. They are related because some renewal strategies triggered the emergence of squatters, like for example, these photos I was showing, here, like the one on the left. So they were calling Instandbesetzung, the first occupation, and it meant the occupation for rehabilitation. So people were squatting because the alternative was that renewal programs were doing a complete clear out of the old, what was remained of the old city after the war, so obliterating completely the historical image of the city. So people started to, well, eventually were students, alternative groups, etc., but they started to occupy also in order to preserve the image of the city. So these renewal strategies triggered squatting movement. The squatting movement claims, for example, for caution urban renewal, triggered a new form of urban renewal that was called caution, that is part of the plans of the 1984 in Berlin, in which this claim was interjected into the renewal plans in a small scale, but yet it resulted in a little change in the approach to this. And then again, for example, these groups were claiming more participation. And this was also interjected into the software of the local policy making and governance. So although it was never really recognized from where it comes, but that's so. But yet, what kind of participation was accepted? A participation that is often claimed as a form of manipulation or the construction of consent more than a real participation. So again, there we see a neutralization from a claim of we want to participate to decisions that affect our surrounding space and our daily life and our lifestyle and the production of the urban space, to just mere simple questions or where I should locate this object in a park, while they have already decided that there will be a 1,000 square meter development, private development in the surrounding area. And also, like, participation often involves very irrelevant question to the local inhabitants. Just to give the impression that you're participating to the process, but that you're actually not participating to decisions that involves actual power gain and interests and lobbies, etc., etc. So yeah, I guess that.
Should we see if at home there's people, let's see, who want to
Yeah, sure.
ask questions? I don't know, do we have 5 participants at home?
I'm going to shut the presentation.
Yes. Diogo Martins wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Diogo.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can listen to me. So I have 2 very brief questions. One is in your presentation, you connect sort of movement with the idea of the growth. But it's also true that despite, this sort of movement is enabled by citizens, it does not mean that this sort of public projects, they do not require a significant amount of, let's say, public investment, of capital investment. So in that sense, for many of these projects to be, sustainable over time, you still need that kind of investment. So it's not the fact that you somehow decentralize and you remove, let's say, the local government from the center of the picture, that somehow removes the growth that is associated, the idea of investment, the idea of creating capital, that is associated with many of these projects to provide social services. So I would like to understand exactly how you necessarily connect this with the growth. The second thing is, if you could elaborate a little bit in terms of, let's say, comparative politics and comparative social movements, because I feel that this sort of, commitment of, let's say, low scale, citizen level, let's say, participation, it's very specific of some European contexts, let's say Germany and Italy, in which I feel that, because in fact left political parties lost a lot of significance over the last decades, many of these, let's say, political commitment moved to these more base organizations. But for instance, when we look at Portugal, we have exactly the opposite. So it's very difficult somehow to enable this citizen level sort of movements, because everything is very dependent on party politics, and also on the local strategies that are associated with those party politics. So my question is if you consider some sort of comparative reflection associating these differences, because for instance, I feel that in Portugal, this sort of large-scale citizen movements that enable communities and provide services and renew public spaces, it's very hard to implement, or at least it's very hard to implement without some strong connection with more institutional based politics. So just.
You can get everything?
Sorry, I didn't got all the words of the question.
Yo, just to let you know, the sound is not perfect here. So
You got it?
more or less, I think Yo was asking something about comparative analysis of different cities and projects, but I think that they also the role of political parties. Yeah.
I was also thinking about
So we can.
Okay.
should consider also the role that political parties may play or not. But with members of the Green
What's the political opportunity structure,
Yeah.
as they call it? Thank you, Diogo.
Sorry, I didn't got all the
But
words.
also,
So
I think Diogo was asking about like a comparative sort of political economy of these projects in Europe, in a way.
Okay.
Sorry if I'm wrong, Diogo.
Okay, I will try to reply if I understood it right. Otherwise, please ask me again the question. So the first question is that if the growth, how these movements are related to growth, when sometimes we're talking about small projects or big projects, and it not always needs to involve subsidiarity between public actors and informal actors. That was the first question. I don't know if it was
sort of.
Yeah, okay. So
Sort of.
I could observe many different cases, obviously, and as you say, for sure, sometimes it's not even needed. But as I was trying to explain before, when it's observed from an urban planner point of view, when you are in the middle of a negotiation between stakeholders' interests, okay, so I'm here basically talking about urban conflict situations. So I want to develop area, I want to privatize a structure, I want to change the use of another place, etc. And this involves conflicts among stakeholders, as we know. So there is a general theory in which I create a space in which each of these actors can intervene and negotiate in order to find a solution that is good for everybody. But the reality of the fact is that public administration tends to address only the interests of big actors or private investors, since are the more reliable and in economic terms. And that creates an even more strong sense of exclusion from those groups that were already feeling excluded. And in this sense, the possibility to individuate, like to recognize that these groups can have a strong contribution when it comes to subsidiarity or well-defined forms of co-production, self-management of spaces, I think it would give more relevance to collective actors that participate to a round table in which solutions have to be individuated. And, you know, I don't know if I explained myself. It gives more power to a bottom-up collective proposal, because it talks about the fact that there have been analyzed tools, as I was saying, to recognize those practices, analyze if they're effective or not, etc. And so maybe stand a chance to, at some point, become an actual alternative that, as you say, can sometimes be related to big issues of growth, sometimes not, but when it is, they can come into play for real. So in the case of Berlin, the conflicts I've been analyzing were mostly or very big urban renewal projects, as I was saying, Mediaspre, Tempelhof. So we're talking about huge areas of the redevelopment, mostly addressing private interests and projects. So this is very related to a growth-oriented view of urban development. But as I was trying to mention in this presentation, even little cases like the privatization of a single public building can still be related to these right-sizing policies that are often related to smart shrinkage. And that's what I say is related to growth on a more extended understanding. So it's not, you know, it is not so visible on a single case, but when you analyze it in a more complex vision of how the public administration approach these kind of problems, I think you can again go back to that growth-oriented vision, because growth-oriented vision means also relocation, as I was saying, of middle classes or creative classes to a certain area, for pushing for gentrification, because it means growth in terms of paying higher level of taxes. That means contributing more to the funds of the public administration and easing the work of the public administration in a certain area. And this is again related to growth. So my degrowth versus growth analysis was, on one side, we see a constant relying on strategies that will bring more money. That's just to be very simplistic. In the other case, we see a community that propose that through collective collaboration, community-based solution, etc., we can find solutions that produce zero cost for the administration. And so at this point, a growth solution is not needed anymore. I don't know if I explained myself. So this would be my first answer, if I hope I answered right. And the second one is about the role of political party, and this is very important, crucial topic, I think. For how I see it, and then for sure, from country to country, from city to city, situations changed along the time. But from what I can analyze, basically, these mobilized groups were much more related to political parties in the 60s, 70s, and after the Second World War. Well, also before, but I mean, until more or less this neoliberal shift started, in which this general post-political thinking emerged that includes the vision in which all the parties are the same, they're all corrupted, etc., bringing to the final solution for many movements to just differentiate themselves from parties. For example, take Barcelona, the PAV movement that achieved in few years to become a very relevant housing movement, known internationally in Europe, having a pretty good impact on political decision in Spain. Yet, when it standed the chance to enter politics through his spokeswoman, that was Ada Colau, that became the city mayor, the first thing of the movement was to declare that they were not supporting this movement or entering like the political arena, that they didn't recognize any party, that they want complete autonomy from parties, they didn't support any party, didn't want support from any party. And this is a kind of discourse I heard in the groups that I know the most, that is Rome, Berlin, and Barcelona. I don't really know well how is it here in Portugal, so I wouldn't say that it's the same. But basically, what I observed is that from the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, in particular after the fall of the wall on, there was this process of disintegrating the radical left in terms of political parties, in particular distancing it from its political base, so the groups of active movements and people that was doing political practices in its everydays and you know, and making radical political proposals like the party did in the last decade, for example. And this actually, for me, had a huge impact on the fact that today these movements are just building barricades, as I say, and are not able to actually impact political decision because they removed themselves from the political arena and from the democratic discussion. In the moment in which you don't have any party representing you in the actual political arena and in the democratic debate, among parties with lobbies and groups of interest, because you don't want to participate in that game, it means that in the moment in which big decisions are taken related to actual policy changes or strategy changes, you're not going to participate. And I think this have a big impact on this create a big difference on the impact these movements can have today. But this is my very personal opinion. I don't know if I will answer to your questions again.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Questions at home? Here? No? I don't know if Lara or Luca or want to ask something? No.
Like this, yeah.
Maybe, yeah. All right. So, I mean, if we don't have anyone, maybe I can ask something. Well, one of the things that, I mean, apart from what we said, that I totally agree, that's one of the reasons we put together, because right? So I think what we just said could actually be something that you can pick up on and add to your to the way that you look at this data and the story that you're telling, right? Also, all right, so there is that, but I was also thinking in a sort of more Polanyian way, right? Because the story you seem to be telling is one of constant, apart from only this constant interaction between institutions and this particular campaign and group. There's also a sort of, for me, a sort of Polanyian story, right? Of like constant privatization and counter movement of privatization, liberalization, and counter movement trying to resist that, but apparently not so very successful because like then it kind of infiltrates the own spirit of the squads and so on and so forth, right? But one of the things I was thinking, there was a paper that was written by a PhD colleague actually on Greece, on sort of, but more on when Greece during austerity and populations that lost status and high unemployment and how they rebuilt their communities. I mean, this goes a bit in the direction of what Julio was saying, and so in like these arenas as infrastructure, but I wanted to ask something a bit different, which is, and I think you pointed at that during the presentation, which is, do these people, because what he identified was that this counter movement, this street counter movement, very localized, and because he analyzed a specific neighborhood in Athens. Not only they developed services, direct action in order to replace the state, but they also created a new symbology, if you want, a new narrative around the story of the neighborhood. Like almost like an imagined community. So I was thinking as I was listening to you, was there any sort of imagined community that developed, that these guys that helped them to like keep cohesion and keep them together? There was any kind of shared symbols that they had in their history and so on and so forth.
Well, for sure, I always call it counter-imaginarium. It has been built particularly in Berlin along the time, but then it doesn't necessarily correspond among groups, because for sure this is real in who identify himself as part of the squatter movement, although it's already almost 30 years that nobody's squatting. I mean, this case I mentioned, it's a very special case because since the beginning of the 90s and the last big repression, nobody's been squatting anymore in Berlin because of the high level of repression. Yet, people that are part of these house projects or a certain kind of alternative groups, they kind of recognize themselves as part of this squatter movement. Although they don't call themselves squatters, but they still recognize themselves in that kind of imaginary. So alternative radical groups that try to take out of the kind of capitalist of the market process certain parts of the city with a very, and there is all a rhetoric about social justice and like anti-capitalism and and like being developing alternatives out of all that capitalism means. That means also, like, for example, nuclear family, so the collective living against the nuclear family, the being against private property, being against many of the pillars that constitute capitalist society. It's also creates a kind of an imaginarium, I would say, in which a certain group identifies itself. And that's very important for the political action at the moment of finding a reason why, keep fighting when you have to face regression, you have to face a constant fluctuating number of participants to a certain group. Today we are 1,000, tomorrow we are 10. So it's exactly this imaginarium, I think, that make these groups existing a long time. But yet, in this case, we analyzed, for example, different groups had different imaginariums. Within these groups, we have squatters, but we have also neighbors, and we have like Turkish community, and each of them have their own idea also of the neighborhood in a way. Yeah. For sure, the neighborhood itself, as I was mentioning at the beginning with this Kreuzberg mission or mix, it's a neighborhood that developed a common imaginary related to this very alternative space with a lot of with a very big mix, not only in terms of population but also in terms of uses. It's a urban space that has a high level of mixed use of the urban space in terms of shops, production spaces, housing. Is not very, it's really like high mixed use space. And I think all this created along the time some kind of specific imaginary that is actually again neutralized and co-opted by the public administration when it comes to the selling of the area. I was looking on the paper I wrote to mention a specific sentence that was written in the Kreuzberg St. Kreuzberg borough page, in which I can find it, but in which it defines the thriving neighborhood, the coolest in the city, exactly because of its big social mix and because of its history of political protests that made it cool and all this alternative heritage. So all this imaginarium, it comes to get a big value in the moment in which this inter-urban competitiveness that the global cities are facing today, in which differentiate the image of a city means to win a competition among cities, because again, there are other factors that are producing a constant destruction of diversity, and instead diversity is exactly that point in which a city can be more attractive for tourism, more attractive for new creative economies and creative classes, as Florida was saying. So I think that
it reminds me a lot of what Marc Allegra and Claudio Carbone say about Arroyos in a way, right? It's that it's also almost like if these activists almost force themselves gentrifiers in a way or another, right? And they actually being political, it's cool, and so they brought more people and tourists to see the area as well, no?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a debate on the fact that these spaces at some point were becoming a problem because were identified as cool. At some point, while they resulted like a problem, a form of social deviancy for a long time. A shift in understanding of the city growth in Berlin from the intent to relocate big companies in the city that actually didn't work so much that the city almost faced bankruptcy in the 90s, to a shift to a creative city in early 2000s, in which a book that was written that's called Urban Pioneers is basically analyzing exactly these kind of practices and saying how much this constitutes a big potential for the city to become a thriving, attractive city. And so since then, all these realities became gold for the city development, for the attraction of international investments, of tourism, etc., etc. So suddenly, from a form of resistance, they became eventually they were co-opted, hijacked into, and that's the last phase I was trying to describe with these temporary uses policies. That's exactly what happened in Rosso Studios or other places. you give a place for a short time to a group of active citizens, and it is all described as amazing because you're including, local communities into creating spaces and activities and stuff.
You increase the price and then you sell.
But at the end, basically, you're using them to again go on with a growth-oriented vision of the
Yeah, it reminds me two papers that I can send it to you. I have to find them, that I read them a while ago, but by Goran Terborn and Nancy Fraser. And but basically, they talk about this capitalist dynamics whereby, the resistance is always co-opted in a way because of the flexibility that capitalism has in integrating all of these elements as well.
I was showing in the last slide one image of I don't know if we can put it back on well, the place that was spotted. It's a place on the River Spree in Berlin where there was this very famous murals by Blue. There are these two men uncovering each other's, one pointing a W as west and the east, that was representing the meeting between West and East Berlin, and the other that it's a man with two golden watches and a chain. So they were very critical and beautiful murals that eventually became part of all the guides over Berlin, very touristic attraction, until the point in which this empty plot in front of these murals was sold to, if I'm not wrong, BMW. And so I think it's a very interesting story because the Blue decided to destroy his own murals. One night he went there and painted all black because he felt that he was participating to what we were saying, to creating an imaginary that was ultimately sold for
I think
this reason.
Volha, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, has a question that it is written there, just to finish our seminar for today.
Luca Iazza?
No, here.
Yeah. They don't only really heard the.
I know Luca asked a question, but wait, Luca, there's two questions actually.
Okay.
Vola asked this one, and then Luca asked another one.
But are there any specific digital infrastructures, places that make the movement resilient over time? Well, all the cities that have been analyzing have a web page where there are different things. It used to be a web page where basically there were all the actions or like the debates, talks, political talks in different spaces, concert, gigs, activities, all related to, I was specifically researching, for example, squatted or related to squatting places. But more recently, what I see is that there is a lot of use of apps like Telegram. For example, it became very important for many groups normally they have one group that is more public, where you are not active, in which they just send general information about the stop eviction that day, or that, I don't know, meeting the other day, or etc. And then there are normally more private groups in which there is internal organization that can get from more political to more like technical organization of the everyday's activities. So yes, for sure, it's important making movement resilient on one side, because it keeps for a participant visible the numbers. Because sometimes, as I said, you go to an assembly and then you can be 5 people one day, and then you can think, okay, it's not anymore, it's relevant, nobody's coming, we lost the struggle, you know. But then you have the spaces where maybe there is more people participating. On the other side, I don't know, I will always ask him, as I think if this can also produce the effect of actually reducing participation, because of the fact that everybody participate online, you know, as the activity ones can do on Twitter or whatever thing, and it's less, it's not involving a physical presence, but yeah, I think it's for sure it's very important. And also it has been very important for us doing research on the field, because it means a lot of archive of information. All these chats and pages have documents, have you know, posters, slogans, etc. We can go back to time, and, right? I guess that you did use it too. And then the second one, it's begin curious to know how the network interact with the neighbors, long-time neighbors.
Yeah, I think looking
Neighborhoods,
for working on something similar.
So in this case, so in the case I analyzed, for example, related to Bethanien in Berlin, the interaction wasn't always easy, because for sure neighbor. So first of all, these squatters that came to occupy the space, I will do the specific example, I guess, because then it would help me to reply to the answer to the question. So the squatter came from another neighborhood and moved there because they were looking for a place to stay, basically, and also to make a political action of protest. Then there were the neighbors, so the actual people that lived around the place, that used the public services, and some they were even working in this activities, so they were actually worried of losing their job. And then there were groups that, as we saw in that quartier management slides I showed, that are also kind of economically fragile or socially fragile groups in the neighborhoods that have other kind of issues or interests. All of these were involved in this conflict, and it wasn't always easy, the interaction between, for example, the squatters and the neighborhoods and the neighbors. So I mean, but as Chantal Mouffe say, the conflict are the base for the political. I mean, political, it's very important that there is also conflictive position and visions. So to have the space to negotiate personal position. For example, in this case, we could have some, because there are a lot of Turkish that are not conservative at all, but there were some, I don't know, Turkish families that were a little bit more conservative, or some older neighbors, or some, you know, and even the radical groups sometimes can sound to me very conservative in the way in which they just have that line they want to follow, it's the same, and sometimes are not able to you know, open up to see the solutions in another way. I can attract a lot of of criticism for this, but that's also what I think. But the interaction, I think it was made out of having a space where to meet up. So actually the occupation of this space and the fact that the neighbors, just because of the squatting, was for the first time able to access the space, because the space wasn't accessible for them until people just break the door and entered. And once they had the space and they started meeting up for different interests, eventually a space for interaction was created. And the fact that each of them needed that space also had the final effect of the necessity of a final effort to interact among different groups, and to build up finally, as Tiago was asking before, actually a shared imaginarium that was this Bethanien South Wing place where all together could, you know, co-live and co-manage and offer something for the neighborhood. But for example, when I went to, they have in the squatted space, they have a place that they call the public space, where they do, for example, for free dinners and movies or political debates. And I was asking how much of the Turkish community around here use this public space. And so, who is using this public space? And the people, the tenants of the parts where people live, they replied to me that actually not many, because they don't recognize themselves in that kind of very punky space that it's all painted and and kind of look like dirty and punk space. So actually maybe they were using other activities inside the building, but so I mean there are a lot of elements to take into consideration. Also, this sometimes I was really I was having a positive prejudice on the fact that these spaces, reclaimed spaces, are for everyone and are much more public than others, but that's not really true. Because they, for example, they exclude, rightfully for me, but they exclude, fascists, showing like people that have like people that cannot access. So it does mean that space is not for everybody, like a public park, everybody can enter, but a space like this actually don't. And also depending on how much groups, neighbors were recognizing the space as a safe space or a place where they wanted to hang out, they were interacting or not with them. I don't know. That's enough for a reply, but I mean, I was trying to say that it's very complicated to describe the interaction because there are many groups of actors with very different opinions, political positions, expectation about the space, way to communicate, way to be able to negotiate or not. That makes it complex to describe. But yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, if there are no questions, we'll close the session here.
Okay.
And thank you again,
Thank
Luisa. Thank you so
you.
much for the simulating presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for coming.